Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Vileisis. I'm president of the Kalmiopsis Audubon Society, and I'm really glad to welcome everyone to this educational program about an important and emerging topic for our region. This online presentation is a reprise of programs we recently hosted at some of our local libraries about offshore wind development off our South Coast, wildlife, and global warming and climate change. As many of you know, the federal government is now considering plans to license areas off our coast for the development of floating offshore wind energy farms. This is a complex issue, and so what I hope we'll accomplish with this program is to share with you the overall process and where it stands now, the reason we're considering it, the urgency of global warming, what exactly the footprint of offshore wind could look like in our region. And finally, because this is Kalmiopsis Audubon, we'll be taking a closer look at what some of this could mean for birds, fish, and wildlife. I hope you'll come away with a better understanding of some of the issues that we're grappling with now. We have two fine speakers today, individuals from our community that have special expertise that they'll be sharing. Dr. Bill Gorham is a retired marine biologist who has had a 30-year career, partly as a consultant working to mitigate the environmental impacts of energy development and other projects. And Mike Graybill, also a retired marine biologist whose career was serving as the director of the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve. And so he's devoted much of his career to helping people to understand the values of coastal and marine ecosystems. Both of them have helped me to understand some of the complexities of this issue. Before we begin, I just want to tell everybody a little bit about Kalmiopsis Audubon. Our group was founded more than 40 years ago by local people who know and care about our place. We have more than 400 members in Curry County, and it's our mission to protect and conserve the remarkable ecosystems of our special corner of Oregon. Our Audubon chapter has been engaging on the issue of floating offshore wind over the past couple of years, pushing for important conservation concerns to be considered early in the siting process. Through my years as a local conservationist, I've come to realize that it's crucial to voice a local perspective when dealing with big federal agencies that don't have much grounding in local ecosystems, communities, issues, and concerns. And so I feel like our group can play an important role. Let's just begin quickly with a primer to set the stage for our discussions today of why we're here. The federal government is now proceeding with plans to lease areas off Oregon's coast for development of floating offshore wind energy projects. The reason they're considering the South Coast is because we have a lot of wind, a lot more than at other places in Oregon, as you can see here. To help you better understand the regulatory framework, it's important to know that the state government has jurisdiction over waters from our coastline to about 3 miles out. It's known as the Territorial Sea. It's governed by our Territorial Sea Plan, and several state agencies have jurisdiction over management of resources in this area. From 3 to 200 miles out, the outer continental shelf, the federal government has jurisdiction, and the agency in charge is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which you'll hear people referring to as BOEM. This is the same agency that's been in charge of offshore oil and gas leases, which I think is important to consider, especially because I think it helps to explain or underscore how concerns about conservation do not seem to be coming until late in the process of figuring out where these things are going to go. Here's a schematic that shows the jurisdictional authorities for near and offshore waters off our coast. So what BOEM is now considering is laying the groundwork for development of floating offshore wind energy projects or wind farms. BOEM is starting now with considering projects up to create 3 gigawatts of energy, a base goal that Oregon's legislature put out as a starting point, because it's been thought that that amount could be readily brought ashore without massive transmission upgrades. So that would translate into about 200 to 250 turbines. But for energy companies to reach economies of scale, we're likely looking at least 17 to 20 megawatts of development in the coming decades, which would mean a number more like 1,400 turbines. At this point, there's no sideboards. And so once we start connecting, there could be still more projects, more call areas, more projects in the future. According to the National Renewable Energy Lab, looking at the whole coast, we have a capacity to generate about 62 gigawatts of energy. I don't think or know if that would be ever likely, but that's sort of the upper end, just to give you a sense of the big picture. So here's where we are now in BOEM's energy siting process. Over the past couple of years, BOEM had some preliminary meetings with the state of Oregon, elected officials, stakeholders about developing floating offshore wind projects. In 2022, BOEM identified call areas, which I'll show you in a moment. And last spring, there was a call for more information from the public and for nominations by wind energy companies. There were over 200 public comments from tribes, fishers, ports, conservationists, and more. And just recently, BOEM announced that there were 4 credible nominations put forward by multinational wind energy companies. In the coming year, it's likely that BOEM will identify more specific wind energy areas within the call areas. There will be an auction for leases, and then companies will be given the opportunity to develop more specific proposals, and there will be more specific analysis after those proposals are put forth. And so you can see there are many years and many steps ahead. So hopefully that gives you some sense of where we're at and why we're bringing up this discussion and information now. The process is moving forward. To drill down a bit more on where we're talking about, here are the call areas that BOEM has identified off our south coast. One reaches from near Charleston north to Florence, and the other is off Curry County. You'll see that these are 2 of 5 areas currently under consideration for wind energy development on the West Coast. California is a little bit farther along. They have 2 wind energy areas, and there's also a lease request up on the Washington coast, and we still have an experimental wave energy development area off the central coast of Oregon. And to help you better understand our most local Brookings call area, here's a map that shows how it extends north from the mouth of the Rogue River south to the California state line, and starting from about 12 to 14 miles offshore and extending to about 40 miles offshore at the southwest corner of this triangle. So now we're going to pull this discussion back and look at why we're having this discussion to begin with. Dr. Bill Gorham will be speaking about how global warming creates a tremendous urgency for us to decarbonize our energy system.
Thanks, Ann. So we'll do a trade over for getting screens coming up. And as we do that, as Ann said, I'm a marine biologist. I taught for about not quite a decade in smaller universities, and then started my professional career in environmental consulting. With that, I did a lot of large projects that were for a whole array of groups. And after retiring about 2017, I turned my attention to global warming. And what I'm talking about today is why we have to really push to decarbonize. So in my experience, the last 5 years in particular, I've learned that we're spewing out 162 million tons of greenhouse gases every day. And that's just a massive amount, and we're continuing to do that. We know that the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. And save for a little blip for COVID, it continues to rise. Now, the question is, why shift to renewable energy? Is this something new? Well, in fact, you've probably heard that in the 70s and 80s, Exxon, their scientists, they had some of the best scientists, and they made projections as to what would happen if Exxon and other oil companies continued to do the same thing they've been doing of burning fossil fuels. Unfortunately, they were spot on. And they know that what they said has proven out right. More recent work is from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, their assessment report 6. This is the 6th version of it. The first volume of their 4-volume set was in 2021. Second and third were in 2022. And there's going to be a final one, it's a summary in 2023. There's also a National Climate Assessment Report. The latest is 2018. There are 2 volumes of that. And there's a new one that's supposed to be out shortly in 2023. We have our local Oregon Climate Assessment Report. The most recent is 2021. And much of what I'll talk about today, what's happening here, is coming from that. IPCC also had several special reports, 3 in particular. One was global warming of 1.5. The Paris Accord was talking about keeping temperatures below 2. And IPCC said, well, what happens if we kept it at 1.5? The impacts at 1.5 are dramatically less than 2. But keep in mind, if you're aware of what's been going on with the climate weirdness, if you will, we're at 1.1. And the difference between 1.1 and 1.5 is dramatic. 1.5 to 2 is even worse. The IPCC also did a special report on climate change and land. And then one that's interest here is the ocean and the cryosphere, the ice. So what are people saying now? Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said from the first report, or the first volume from 2021, greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. As you saw with the chart, that's still happening. Global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. I have to say that just earlier this week, I think it was USA Today, had another quote from Antonio Guterres saying basically the same thing. Now, the co-author of the second volume of the latest IPCC report said, we have to act. We need a whole of society approach. No one can be left out. No household, no business, no government. It's all of us. And a more recent report was a little bit more dire. It's saying meeting the 1.5 Paris Agreement temperature goal is not plausible. But limiting the global temperature rise to well below 2 can be plausible if ambition, implementation, and knowledge gaps are closed. In other words, we have to make the changes. Now, I like this view, which is the blue marble, as it's called. It shows that it is one planet. We are all together. There is no planet B. We have to make it. It's up to us. So we know that temperature rises, global surface temperatures are continuing to go up. We also know that we've had some bizarre conditions. A year and a half ago, probably many of you seeing this will recognize that Pacific Northwest, as well as in many other places in the world, had all-time high temperatures, just astounding high temperatures. In fact, people in Portland or Seattle are well aware of this. Layton, British Columbia, had the highest recorded temperature ever in Canada, all of Canada. And the next day it burned down because of a forest fire. So conditions are dire. Well, what's supposed to happen here in Oregon? We know several things. Now, this is a little bit of a confusing graph. This was taken from one of the earlier IPCC reports. And you'll see they show 2 pictures here. One is what they call a representative concentration pathway. Well, 4.5 versus 8.5. 8.5 early on was what the IPCC said, what if we just continue to do things as we have been? Call it business as usual or worst case assessment. Fortunately, we've made enough changes that this really isn't likely to be happening. This is more likely to be what we're going to see. Now, that means for this graph, and because it was from an earlier IPCC report updated for our Oregon climate assessment report, this shows what the past temperatures had been and as they projected it forward. And notice I said projected because it is not predicted. Projected means that if we do certain things, then other things will follow. It's not a prediction. It's all based on what we do. So our attention is now in this lower graph, this lower brown band. And as we take it forward, we see that, in fact, if we looked at what they had said for 2023, it was projecting from that report 1.1, and that is what we have. And so for the projections were accurate, saying what we were doing. Now, if we project it forward another 23 years to 2050, it is projecting, based on our current activities, that we're headed 2, which if you go back to what the other statements were, that's the projection. And if we take it one step further, by 2075, we're going to be well above the 2, so almost 2.5. And so the impacts are going to be substantial if we keep doing that. Now, what else we know? We know that temperatures are going to be increasing, as it showed. We expect that there'll be changes in snowpack. The expectation is the amount of precipitation will be about the same, but it'll be as rain rather than as snow. That has consequences on what the water availability will be during the summer. It'll also affect the dryness. It'll affect various other things, forest fires and such. We know that their forest fires seem to be more common, and it's not just the burning of the forests, it's the loss of buildings and infrastructure. But for anybody that was here in September of 2020, you remember that it was painful to breathe. It was hazardous air quality for most of the state, which is a very big deal. Now, we're talking about the oceans here, and one of the interesting things of all the heat that has been trapped by the extra greenhouse gases, 93% of it has been trapped into the ocean, which in a way is a good thing, because if it weren't for the ocean, the atmosphere would be 63 degrees warmer than it is today. And right now, the average globally is about 59. If it weren't for the ocean trapping that extra heat, it'd be 122. That was an estimate made by a professor at the University of Queensland. Now, the ocean effects, we know higher temperatures mean to overall it is, as well as marine heat waves. And we see that the temperature that we show on this graph, similar to the one for the atmosphere, is a little smoother because the temperature rise. This represents how much heat energy is now in the ocean, and it continues to go up. This is through 2021. I need to update it with this because 2022 was yet another record high ocean content. So it's not just the surface that's increasing. It's through the various different layers. As it takes a long time to mix the heat through, eventually it'll show an equilibrium as to how much energy, extra energy is coming. Unfortunately, that increase has happened in less than 20 years. Over half of it has happened over the last 20 years. So it's accelerating. I'm a marine biologist, did a lot of time down in the Caribbean, and I really like corals. Unfortunately, those little marine heat waves are just like we have heat waves. They can be devastating. The upper picture is from NOAA. It shows from January 31st this year where the extra level of heat stress is. And you can see the darker red areas are where there's highest chance for coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is the first step to coral death. If you look at the lower one is a 3-month running average, February to May for 2023. That's how they project a 60% probability of coral bleaching due to that. And they're the upper layers, or the darker alert levels show the impacts. So another aspect of global warming is with warmer water, it holds less oxygen. Now, that's a complicated connection, but we see that off the coast here of Oregon since 2002, we've had dead zones. Dead zones are lower areas of lower oxygen, and there are a variety of things that go into it. But what first was identified in 2002 is now a regular event. The worst was in 2006, 2007. Most recent in 2017, 2018, and it's something that we do have to be concerned about. Other changes are a change in the net primary productivity, which means you're going to have different phytoplankton that are going to do better in warmer waters than others. Unfortunately, one of the phytoplanktons groups that do better cause the domainic acid poisoning. And for those of you that are paying attention to the commercial crabbing here, it was last weekend, February 14th, that the Oregon commercial crabbing was first opened. And it affects recreational clamming and others. There's also the suggestion is potential changes to major ocean currents. Right now, the oceanographers off the East Coast are noticing a small but measurable decrease in the movement of the Gulf Stream. Now, the Gulf Stream takes warm water and heat across the Atlantic over to Europe, and if that slows down, the amount of heat going over there could affect things in Europe quite substantially. Now, other major currents, major ocean events, you know of El Nino and La Nina, and the suggestion is that there would be more frequent extreme events. It's worth noting that we apparently are in our third year of a La Nina event, when the El Nino La Nina system is usually every 7 years. So when La Nina is associated with cooler temperatures, when El Nino comes back, we may very well see significant increases in temperatures. So the increased layer of warm water on top of the cooler water means that it doesn't mix as well. We have increased ocean stratification. Now, there are a variety of things that fit into that, but as winds change, that can affect upwelling, which also is affected by stratification. Now, it's interesting because the suggestion is with climate change, the wind will be more intense. The more intense wind will affect coastal upwelling. Now, others say that, yeah, if you look at the California current that goes from British Columbia down to Baja, there are a lot of differences as you go through it, special points. So how the overall changes are going to be manifested are hard to tell. That's why I wanted to focus more on the physical side rather than getting into the detailed global warming and changes that are on that level. Now, with warmer water, you see the water will expand in size. And so half of the sea level rise right now is just the warmer water taking up more space. The other half, of course, is from the melting of land ice. Just a picture here for those of you that are familiar with Coos Bay. Here is at the current mean high water. If you were to have just a 2-foot rise, you'd see a little bit of a change, maybe not a lot. At 5 foot, you can see that places like the airport and the North Spit are going to be affected. So this is all related just specifically, try to focus on temperature rise. And what's important to note is that the more the temperature rises, the greater will be the effects. And that's actually can be empowering, because if we can control how much that temperature rises, then we can reduce the amount, or we can control or affect the amount of the effects. Now, that's specifically temperature, and haven't talked about the chemical side of increased acidification. The interesting thing is if you put CO2 in the ocean and in the water in general, it combines and makes carbonic acid. And in fact, the oceans are now 30% more acidic on average than they were before the Industrial Revolution. Now, that's really significant for any animal that has to produce a shell made of calcium carbonate. And just a couple of examples, one of the favorite foods of salmon and mackerel and herring are pteropods. These are very interesting little tiny free-swimming marine snails, but they're already seeing that some of these snails are having trouble making their shells. If there are no snails, no pteropods or other critters that the fish will be trying to feed on, there's no food, no fish. Similar sort of thing, the larvae of crabs are showing that their shells are dissolving. They are not being able to produce their shells or their sensory organs. And if there are no babies, there are no grown-ups. So these are significant things. We don't much talk about ocean acidification, except for the people that are paying close attention to it. So how do we stop global warming? And I said ocean acidification too. Well, we know the cause. It's excess greenhouse gases primarily from burning fossil fuels. We also know the solution. Stop burning fossil fuels. Sounds easy, but it's not so easy. So we need energy. We need to harness renewables, among other things. Only harnessing renewables is not so easy, as we're going to talk about. Their trouble is with renewables. They're intermittent. They're often away from where users are, and they have their own impacts. Now, I emphasize climate is a complex system of complex components. So there are no simple fixes. The data are few. Our understanding is incomplete. So it's going to be important that we pay attention to and have good thought for it. But as I've emphasized so far, the clock is ticking. The longer we wait, the worse the impacts are going to be. Emphasize we're all in this together, so we have to work together. With that, I'll turn it back to Ann, and I think you'll then introduce Mike.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bill, for helping us to understand the urgency of dealing with decarbonization. That was a really helpful context for this program. So our next speaker today is Mike Graybill, and I'm glad to turn it over to him for his presentation, which asks a really important question about is floating offshore wind a good fit for Oregon? And he's going to help us understand what exactly the footprint of this particular type of energy might look like here. Mike?
All right. Thanks, Ann, and thanks, Bill. My role for this presentation is to put this proposal of floating offshore wind in Oregon into a realistic context so that people who are thinking about this can actually see what scale is under discussion. I'd also like to make sure that since floating offshore wind is a new technology, that I can also put floating offshore wind in the context of the two other forms of wind energy that may be more familiar. Those are onshore wind and bottom fixed wind. And then we'll take a deeper dive into the technology that's involved in floating wind energy. And then finally, we'll take a look at two additional things. One is how ports will need to be modified to facilitate the development of offshore wind. And also, once wind is developed, how it will influence the ocean and how wind in general influences the ocean. So Bill's made the case that we've got an urgent need to decarbonize our energy supply. But my deep dive has brought me to a realization that some decarbonization options are going to be a better fit for Oregon than others. And right now, our current yes to everything approach to decarbonization is not a rational approach, and I don't think it will bring us to the best fit for Oregon. So let's dive in and see what we're talking about in terms of the amount of energy that's under discussion. 3 gigawatts or gigawatts of electricity is about the same amount of electricity that is produced by the Bonneville Dam and the Dalles Dam, the two largest hydroelectric dams on the Columbia River. Wind isn't anything new in the world of renewable energy, but offshore wind is new. In the US, we've already got 70,000 onshore wind turbines, but as of early last year, we only had 7 offshore turbines in the water. Other places on the globe have invested heavily in offshore wind, most notably China and the European nations surrounding the North Sea. So I'll walk you through an example of the types of wind energy production that are in play today. Perhaps the most familiar form of wind energy is the land-based onshore wind farms that many of us have seen in the Columbia Gorge. These tend to have fairly small turbines at 2.3 megawatts is the example here of the Columbia Gorge facility. This is just an illustration of one of 48 farms that are producing power in our state. And you can see that they have simple concrete foundations and that the agricultural production that they're sitting in plows and plants right to the base of the foundations. If we move wind energy into the water, in shallow water areas, it's possible to modify the type of the foundation that supports the tower and the turbine by the construction of these steel jacket foundations. And those then are attached to the seabed with a series of pilings that are driven into the seabed. The turbines in offshore wind are substantially larger. than the turbines that are on land-based wind operations. And then finally, our third example is when you try and install a wind turbine in water that's deeper than about 200 feet, it becomes impractical to make one of those steel jacket foundations. And then you have to shift to a structure that supports each one of the turbine towers and generators with a floating foundation. These tend to be very large, and because they're very large and very heavy, the turbine manufacturers have been making turbines increasingly larger so that fewer foundations are necessary. In this case, the example of the Windfloat Atlantic, the turbines are 8.4 megawatts, or 4 times larger than the turbines on the Columbia Gorge. So if we take a look at the area that the U.S. Department of Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has identified, they've drawn circles on 2 areas of the Pacific off the southern Oregon coast. The Coos Bay Call area is actually larger than the state of Rhode Island, and the Brookings Call area is larger than New York City or Crater Lake National Park, just for some comparison. Again, these are areas that have been proposed to develop an initial amount of electricity at the level of about 3 gigawatts. Well, what's involved in making 3 gigawatts? Well, at the moment, one of the largest wind turbines that are being installed on floating foundations is about 9 megawatts, but this technology is evolving rapidly. So I provided an example of a 12 megawatt turbine, and this is one turbine made by General Electric. There's 2 or 3 other manufacturers do that. In order to make 3 gigawatts of electricity, using 12 megawatt turbines, you would need about 250 of those turbines that are shown in the bottom left. The propellers, or the blades that sweep and turn the turbine, cover an area that's about the size of 7 football fields. Here's an example of one of the blades that would be installed on a 11 megawatt turbine. And to generate 3 gigawatts, you would need to have 3 blades per turbine on 250 turbines. It's clear that the offshore turbines are large enough that transportation on land is not practical. So when we have these large structures placed on floating foundations, they need to be moored to the seabed. And so that creates a unique situation where the cabling system for the electricity has to have some slack in it, so to compensate for the movement of the foundations and the substations. Let's first look at how floating offshore wind foundations are moored to the seabed. This is typically done with large anchors that are attached to a length of chain, then to a synthetic mooring line, typically anywhere between 3 and 9 mooring lines per turbine structure. The anchoring system is called the catenary system, and you typically need at least 4 times, between 3 and 8 times the water depth to secure the anchors in place. Here's an example of one of the mooring lines that would be used to attach the Windfloat Atlantic floating foundation to the seabed off of Portugal. I've estimated that in the water depths that we have off the state of Oregon, we would need on the order of just over 1,000 miles of this type of mooring line and anchor chain to generate the proposed level of 3 gigawatts of electricity. Here's an example of one of the drag embedment anchors that would be used to secure a floating wind turbine foundation to the seabed. In this case, this is a 20-ton drag embedment anchor. Again, you need between 3 and 9 of these per turbine assembly. That would mean that you would need roughly 750 of these anchor assemblies to secure a 3 gigawatt turbine array to the seabed. There's an example of a specialized ship that's used to deploy anchors, with one of the anchors hanging off the stern. The yellow circles are encircling the anchor chain that's attached to the anchor and then is ultimately attached to that synthetic mooring line that rises to the surface. A challenge of mooring systems is that as they move around, as the wind would blow the turbines around, the anchor chain, doing its job, sweeps back and forth and scours and disturbs the seabed. So with hundreds of anchor and mooring chains, there is likely to be a disturbance to the seabed that is worthy of consideration. The floating offshore wind technology is rapidly emerging. Here's a recent example of just the concept for an anchor deployment vessel. It's 500 feet long nearly and over 100 feet wide. And it's capable of carrying anchors and equipment that's needed to moor 3 platforms at a time before it has to run to port and reprovision. And the gear for 3 platforms is roughly 4,000 tons of equipment. So these vessels are roughly the size of the wood chip vessels that are calling on the port of Coos Bay. And this ship, this Damon Shipyards estimates that with the amount of wind energy deployment worldwide, that there'll be a calling for about 100 vessels of this type. Excuse me. So once the turbines are moored to the seabed, then it's necessary to bring the electricity that is produced to a common central offshore substation. And in order to do that, there's electrical cabling within the array of turbines that gathers the power and delivers it to the substation. So this is a diagram that illustrates how 50 turbines would be connected by a inter-array electric cabling system, where all the cables from the individual turbines would be gathered and attached to the offshore substation, where the varying power from each turbine will be combined and conditioned so that it's shipped to shore via high voltage export cable. Just an illustration of a cable laying vessel. My estimate is that there would be several hundred miles, in fact, just nearly 350 miles of inter-array cable to connect the turbines that would produce 3 gigawatts. Again, that electricity from the inter-array network of cables is delivered to a central offshore substation. I don't have an example of what a floating substation looks like, but this is what a 900 megawatt bottom fixed substation looks like. It would be necessary to create a floating structure of this kind and roughly 3 structures of this scale to process 3 gigawatts of electricity. No floating utility scale substations have been deployed, and the high voltage cables that are flexible, these dynamic cables, have yet to be tested. And the transformers that have traditionally been used for fixed bottom offshore substations have fluid inside them. And right now, the engineers are concerned that the transformers won't perform won't be able to respond to the motions of the at-sea. So this is, suffice to say that utility scale floating offshore wind power is really still developmental and still untested. And just for comparison, to demonstrate that, the world's largest floating wind energy factory is planned to be the Pentland Floating Wind Farm. and it's to have a capacity of 100 megawatts. That means that BOEM's proposal to develop 3 gigawatts of electric power off the coast of Oregon is 30 times larger than this Pentland wind farm, the world's largest wind farm. And the depths of water off the Oregon coast are typically at greater than 6 times deeper than the largest floating wind farm in the world. So now let's shift to say what happens on the shoreline where the components of these floating wind plants are gathered, manufactured, and assembled. There's various functions needed to support offshore wind industry. They've been characterized as 4 different kinds of port facilities, and I'll show you some examples of those. The modification of estuaries to accommodate offshore wind require substantial filling and substantial development of high-strength concrete decking to carry the very, very heavy loads that offshore wind equipment uses. So here's an example of the Hull Greenport on the Humber estuary in England. And you can see these large towers being assembled, but you can also see the amount of landfill that was necessary in order to accommodate the space and the structures needed to support this industry. I'll move to floating wind. This is a facility in Finland that is assembling some spar foundations that will be deployed in some oil fields off the coast of Scotland. And the area that's encircled, it will be the area that's covered in the next slide, just to give you a sense of the scale. The structure that's laying with in the background is the floating spar foundation, a single foundation. And we'll show a picture of that here in a moment, but just for scale, I've drawn a circle around a large charter bus that delivers work crews to the point of assembly here. Here's an example of a marshalling port where materials are stockpiled and turbine towers and assembly are assembled and delivered to the barges that will deliver the components and install them at sea. Again, this is a fixed bottom offshore wind area. The space that's required for floating offshore wind will be larger than that because fixed bottom wind turbines are assembled at sea. And floating wind turbines are assembled in port and towed to sea. There's another one in Denmark. I've circled the smokestack from a power plant that adjoins the wind turbine facility. And you can see the scale of the development in this estuary that was necessary to accommodate the wind port. The United States is a newcomer to offshore wind, so many more examples in Europe and China. But here's an example of where New Jersey's getting started. They will do large cement overlays on a tidal wetland in the Delaware River and create road corridors across functioning wetlands. Once the facilities on shore are developed, then large vessels will call on these ports that may require additional dredging. But there's also just a huge amount of materials required to support the logistics of developing a large wind generating facility, electric generating facility in the middle of the ocean. So you can see here's one cable laying vessel that's got a construction cost of $162 million. It has space on board for a 120-person crew and a helicopter landing pad for an 18-passenger helicopter. This is the scale of vessel and the nature of the operations for the construction of offshore wind. This is an example of turbine blades that were manufactured in China and delivered to their deployment location in Spain. And just for scale, I've circled the person or the crew member on the deck. In floating foundations, it's necessary to have deep water because the foundations actually have quite a deep draft. And in this case, that you can now see the yellow spar foundation that was laying on its side in that shipyard in Finland that had the bus parked in front of it. And it's necessary to assemble these things in calm water before they're towed out into the open ocean. But you can see the scale of equipment that's necessary to accomplish these tasks, because these turbine assemblies now weigh more than 1,000 tons. There's a possibility that Oregon's estuaries won't have sufficient depth to do this kind of assembly work. So what I hope you might surmise from some of this is that some green energy is greener than others. It's certainly become evident to me when I see the amount of steel and the equipment and the number of ships that are involved in building a electric generating plant in the ocean and securing it to the seabed. So here's a quick estimate that just the foundations for a 3 gigawatt wind plant will involve more than 600,000 tons of steel, and that doesn't include quite a number of other considerations. Just simply looking at the mineral intensity of some forms of renewable energy technologies, or actually all forms of energy technologies, you can see that offshore wind is twice as copper intensive than onshore wind is. Those are the two top lines. And that's because offshore wind has all this inter-array cabling, and that's this copper jacketed cabling. So here's an example of a cable laying ship, people stacking cable on the deck, a cross section of cabling in the hand. And so cabling accounts for most of the copper that's used in offshore wind farms. And floating offshore wind will require even more cabling because they're deployed in deeper water, and because there has to be additional dynamic cable to compensate for the movement of the platforms. An illustration here on the left showing what a subsea cable looks like with the three copper conductors. And on the right is an example of an overland high voltage transmission cable that you might see strung from the large metal transmission towers as you drive along the highway. Well, now let's go to the ocean and just say, well, we're putting all this in the ocean because the wind blows. Well, the California current is something that Ann referenced, and the wind in our region moves water, and it moves water in a complex variety of ways. Wind over water has a very, very different interaction than wind over land, because when wind blows over water, it moves the water, in contrast to when wind blows over land, it doesn't move the land. So this water is a three-dimensional realm, and so water can move north, south, east, and west, and it can also sink from the surface and rise to the surface. And in our area, all those things happen. But in addition to simply moving water, it also moves nutrients and various chemical constituents that are really important to the productivity of our ocean. We're in a very productive portion of the ocean here in Oregon, one of these 4 large upwelling areas, most productive places on the planet. So really, for me, the bottom line is that the wind in Oregon produces the fish in Oregon. But when we then go out to harvest the wind at sea, we'll reduce the amount of wind energy that's inducing this water movement and producing these fish. And people have modeled this who are considering wind energy along our coast. And in one case, down off of Morro Bay, the people who have modeled how a wind turbine assembly would alter the wind found that very large areas of the ocean have altered wind patterns on them as a result of these turbine arrays. The top picture shows turbine wakes or in a foggy area so that you can actually get a visualization of what happens downstream from a turbine. But when you put large structures in the water and the water is moving, those structures actually also alter the movement of water and the composition of the water column. So my understanding of the issue is that offshore wind will reduce the area that's available for fishing or seafood production, but onshore wind actually increases the income that farmers use or that farmers derive from the use of their land. And when I consider the fact that there's a very large potential for development of wind energy on land that does not interfere with agricultural or food production, and I compare that to a very productive piece of ocean that is important for food production and how wind development there will diminish the availability of food production, I'm forced to conclude that some types of wind energy or renewable energy might be a better fit than others for us here in Oregon. So I just have a slide here that shows a few issues that I've identified in the course of my research that I haven't really touched on in my presentation, but I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Ann. Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation that really helps to make concrete and helps us all to understand what exactly this particular floating offshore wind means and could mean for our ocean. So for the third part of this program, I'm going to be picking up the ball and talking from the perspective of Kalmiopsis Audubon about what potential floating offshore wind development means for birds, fish, and wildlife. I'll be talking briefly about the importance of Oregon's offshore waters for birds and other wildlife. I'll discuss briefly some of the potential impacts that we're concerned about, and finally share with you some recommendations we put forth to improve the process and to minimize and avoid impacts as much as possible. First, I want to emphasize that Oregon's offshore waters are a special place, not just an empty space. Our offshore marine environment is part of the globally significant California Current large marine ecosystem, which is renowned for its biodiversity and productivity associated with the upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich waters. It's one of only 4 eastern boundary upwelling zones in the world on the edges of the major continents. And these areas comprise just 4% of the ocean's area, but 20% of all its productivity. These are rich areas. And because of Oregon's coast's geographic complexity and oceanography, we have many different species of plants and animals that can be found here. So it's important that we get to know who's living out in this area. The outer continental shelf off California, Oregon, and Washington will be among the first of these eastern boundary upwelling zones in the world where a floating offshore wind will be sited. So it's crucial that we make sure we protect the processes, patterns, and features that promote the enhanced biological productivity of our upwelling zone. So here's a diagram that shows the California Current ecosystem. It's important to remember it spans the entire West Coast. And it's the same windiness that is now drawing wind prospectors to our area. It's also the powerful force that underlies the incredible productivity of this ecosystem. Here's a diagram that shows how it works. We have powerful wind-driven currents that create a gradient in temperature set upon a gradient in topography at the continental shelf drop-off, which helps to catalyze the upwelling of the cold, clean, nutrient-rich waters, which nourishes abundant plankton and zooplankton, such as krill, that becomes the base of an ocean food chain. And it's this food abundance that makes Oregon's offshore waters so incredibly important for the birds, fish, and wildlife that come here. Let's first consider birds. Oregon's offshore waters are very productive for birds. We have more than 1.3 million seabirds that nest off our coast and about 400 colonies on our offshore rocks and islands. And the key thing to know is Oregon has 1/3 of the west coast shoreline of the continental US, but our coast provides half of all the seabird breeding habitat. And then within Oregon, our south coast provides more than half of Oregon's seabird habitat. So our south coast offshore nesting colonies are literally seabird central for the whole west coast. And one of the avian stars is certainly the tufted puffin, as you see here. Beyond breeding birds, Oregon waters are part of a north-south migration route, the Pacific Flyway, that some seabirds have used for millennia. And here you can see some of the birds that follow the path. Some of them are migrate closer into shore and some of them farther out in deeper waters. Beyond breeding and migration, our nutrient-rich Oregon offshore waters provide foraging grounds that draw seabirds from all around the Pacific. You see here we've got shearwaters that come from Australia and from the tip of South America. And even the critically endangered short-tailed albatross comes all the way across the Pacific from Japan. And they're coming to these California current-rich upwelling waters to forage. Our windy offshore waters are truly a region of international importance for seabirds. All told, nearly 100 different waterbird species have been documented that come to use Oregon's offshore waters, and about 70 of those are regular visitors. Many of the birds that live in deeper waters are not very familiar to us because we rarely see them. They rarely make it to shore, but they certainly are well adapted to their life at sea. Here's a northern fulmar. It's in a class of birds called tube noses, and you can see atop their bill they have special glands that extract salt, which enables them basically to drink seawater. They're also long-lived birds with a median age of about 32 years. It's interesting because many seabirds live longer than you might expect. Here again is a fulmar, which is about the size of a gull, next to a black-footed albatross, which is a much larger bird. We have several species of albatross that come to Oregon waters. These dynamic soaring seabirds are known for their massive wingspans, and they rely on air currents to glide and migrate long distances across the ocean to forage. In general, albatross are also very long-lived birds, living over 50 years. There's a world-famous one named Wisdom who's reached 70 years now. They mate for life, but the birds breed infrequently and produce only a few chicks annually, which means their populations depend on adult survival over the long term. And that makes their populations especially vulnerable to the risks of collision with wind turbines, which could kill adults, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. For context, I want to mention too that seabirds are the most threatened group of birds in the world due to so many threats, including climate change that Bill's already talked about, but also invasive predators, poor management of the forage fish stocks that they need, plus pollution, including plastics. All those compounding threats to birds, to seabirds, are important to recognize because it's going to be crucial to minimize any additional pressure on these vulnerable populations. We've also got other marine life that resides in our offshore waters: gray whales, orcas, and humpbacks. Oregon coastal waters are a space that gray whales migrate through each year, as many of us know firsthand. We go out and watch them on the headlands. It's always so fun to see them. These waters are also federally designated critical habitat for two distinct populations of endangered humpback whales. And also, there's critical habitat for southern resident killer whales as well. Beyond the big three, we've also got many more species of whales and cetaceans, many of them endangered, which I didn't even realize foraged in our offshore waters until I started to learn more about this topic. So we really have a lot of biodiversity out there. We also have many different species of seals and sea lions. Another cool creature that comes to Oregon waters to forage are endangered Pacific leatherback sea turtles. These critically endangered, massive and long-lived sea turtles are the largest in the world. They reach up to 2,000 pounds when they're adults, but they hatch on tropical beaches in Indonesia. But then when they grow up, they travel nearly 7,000 miles across the Pacific to forage for sea jellies in spots along the West Coast, especially in Oregon's waters, especially to the north of here. This is one of the longest migrations of any air-breathing marine mammal. We've also got hundreds of species of fishes that reside in the California current off Oregon, some migratory, some resident, and most are not really well known. Some are targeted by our offshore fisheries, which is another whole topic that I'm not really touching on in this program. I'll just mention that local fishermen are very concerned that wind energy development will exclude them from their fishing grounds. This photo also shows the importance of sea bottom habitat and underwater reefs. We urged BOEM to exclude rocky reef areas from consideration. That was a recommendation also made by fishermen, local elected officials, governor. So hopefully most of those areas will be excluded. But there are also coral reefs off our coast, which I had not realized. Here you can see some spots where bamboo and black coral reefs exist out in the Brookings Call area. These corals are slow-growing, long-lived creatures that provide nursery habitat for fishes on our seafloor. So we've established our offshore areas are rich and remarkable and full of life. And so the big questions remain. What are the primary concerns with offshore wind development? And what do we do to avoid them or minimize them? From what I've learned so far, siting will be the single most important decision made if we want to avoid and reduce environmental conflicts in the future, which is why it's so important to understand how the proposed call areas are used by birds, fish, and wildlife, and also by other users such as shippers and fishermen. There are no real operational floating turbines yet in deep upwelling ecosystems anywhere in the world. The only prototypes now are off Scotland. And so while we have general knowledge of how some of the types of impacts and conflicts that there will be with birds and wildlife, there remain a lot of unknowns. So let's consider first siting. To try to site these facilities in places with the least impacts depends on data and mapping. And starting to make sense of this, I was really glad we had the opportunity to work with some conservation scientist colleagues at Portland Audubon, American Bird Conservancy, and Oceana to do some more specific spatial analysis. Some of you know Joe Liebezeit, who has helped lead our Black Oystercatcher survey down on the South Coast, and he helped come up with these maps, which show existing areas that are known to be important habitat areas for birds, fish, cetaceans. You can see that on the left. And on the right side, the critical habitat areas for the whales and also for the leatherback turtles. If you take a closer look at the Brookings Call area, you can see how these different layers of known areas that are important for birds, fish, and wildlife kind of line up and stack up. And in particular, the critical habitat for humpback whales, I think, stands out here. Mapping and modeling that will be used to site wind projects depends on the underlying data. And the effort to move forward with wind energy development has been driving investment in additional research about birds, fish, and wildlife. But there are still huge data gaps. There are a lot of birds and animals that we know very little about, especially what they do during the winter months when it's dangerous to do science in the North Pacific. But this map on the left gives a sense of the nature of the existing bird data. It's based on at-sea transects done up and down the coast, where observers went out in boats and basically counted the birds and identified the birds that they saw. This data is very coarse. I mean, they didn't necessarily always see a lot of birds, or, in different seasons, if there was only one transect in one place, you can imagine there would be a lot of variables about whether you'd see birds or not. But this is what we have. And so this is the kind of data that is the basis for understanding. And you can see on the right a more advanced visualization of the location of black-footed albatross, where they might be seen in the summer off the coast. But it's to underscore like the fact that there may be very few detections even in understanding this. Here's a specific example. The short-tailed albatross is the largest and most critically endangered of the northern hemisphere albatrosses, distinguished by its golden head and showy pink bill. This bird nests on islands in Japan, but adolescent birds come to Oregon's outer continental shelf to forage each year. And so you can see here, these maps show the observations and detections of these rare birds in the Brookings Call area. There's not that many, but they show us that these birds are here. Interestingly, these birds had been nearly annihilated by plume hunters a century ago, but they've made a slow but strong recovery over the past years. From a low of just 10 pairs, the population's increased to the current estimate of more than 7,000 individuals. So, of course, it would be great to continue their recovery. To consider the least harmful location for floating wind arrays, Joe at Portland Audubon, together with some other colleagues, used seabird data to model estimated seabird hotspots in each season for a whole grouping of the birds that were predicted to have the highest densities in the call areas. In this case, in the spring, you can see that there are likely to be more birds present in the eastern part of the call area. But it's also always important to consider the life histories of specific birds. For example, we have quite a lot of Leach's storm petrels in our area. Nearly 500,000 birds breed south of Cape Blanco, and the vast majority of these are on rocks just north of the Brookings area. These birds nest in burrows on offshore islands that have grassy tops and come and go only under the cover of darkness to avoid predation. But you can see they traverse the Brookings Call area to head out to deep water pelagic feeding grounds. So we'll have to be particularly careful and understand these birds when we're sighting the wind turbines. It's also important to know that storm petrels are particularly vulnerable to lights, which literally can draw these birds like moths. So that's another important consideration for these birds in particular. We've also got spatial analysis for other animals. Humpbacks, you can see, are here in every month, but they are generally 5 to 15 miles offshore, so they're most often seen by fishers. And with fish, we don't have a lot of good maps about fish themselves, but we do have mapping based on fisheries, where fish are caught. And of course, fishermen know a lot about where the best place is to catch fish. So these are other kinds of spatial data that will be used to help figure out what are the best places to site wind farms with the least impacts. So we've talked about the siting and the science between trying to locate the spaces with the least impacts. Let's now talk about the potential risks that the actual turbine arrays could pose. With birds, we have 3 types of vulnerabilities that have been identified. Birds that have low populations to begin with, such as threatened endangered species, or birds with small populations that are year-round residents in project areas, are considered to have a high population vulnerability. So killing of these birds inadvertently could really impact populations. Birds that have the highest collision vulnerability are those that spend a large amount of time flying at night, or those birds that spend a lot of time in the elevation that'll put them right into the rotor swept zone. Birds that don't flap their wings but are obligate gliding, soaring seabirds that depend on wind are also likely to be vulnerable because they enter the turbine space and are not as maneuverable as powered flyers. Finally, there are the birds that have high vulnerability to displacement. These are birds that don't have much habitat flexibility, and this this preliminary analysis of how birds might react to wind farms is based on behavior of similar types of taxa at wind farms in the North Sea. And it's this kind of analysis, that BOEM scientists will be doing to figure out if there are places that the turbines can go that will minimize impacts. We don't yet have as detailed analysis for other animals such as fishes and marine mammals, but research suggests, for example, that some kinds of fishes, including sharks and sturgeon, that depend on electromagnetic fields for navigation, could be affected, not by the turbines, but by the electric cables associated with wind arrays. That's just one example. There's also concerns about entanglement and many other things to sort out. As I've said, this type of floating offshore wind technology has not been deployed on this scale. So these are things to be figured out. And finally, there really is a need to consider cumulative impacts of all these possible projects that span the larger California current ecosystem. How will animals like gray whales that migrate the whole way be affected? And this set of call areas and wind energy areas is just the beginning. As part of the formal BOEM process, when there was an opportunity for public comments last summer, Kalmiopsis Audubon, as part of a coalition of Audubon chapters and other conservation groups, joined with hundreds of other people and groups in submitting concerns and recommendations. You can see here some of our comments. And if anybody wants to read our full comments, don't hesitate to be in touch. I'd be happy to send them to you. You'll see, in short, we were trying to get them to not put turbines in areas that are important for endangered species and to try to put them in areas where there would be the least impacts. We also were asking to include a cumulative impacts analysis early on in the process. But the thing that's so frustrating about this BOEM process, which is focused only on leasing our outer continental shelf for energy development, is that it doesn't give us space to answer what may be important, larger questions. Does floating offshore wind make sense for our place, for Oregon? And as Mike has raised, are there better, faster ways to decarbonize with better known risks and technologies? These are definitely important questions to consider, I think, before we dive in deeper. Before I end my part of the program, I just wanted to tell you, if you want to learn more, check out this excellent report authored by the Oregon Department of Energy, which looked at the benefits and challenges of developing floating offshore wind off our coast. It provides a really good and balanced overview, and I think you can Google Oregon Department of Energy and floating offshore wind to find it. I'm going to leave it at that. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And if you've made it this far, I hope we've given you some important things to think about. I want to thank Bill and thank Mike for contributing their expertise and raising very important questions and concerns for our South Coast. So stay tuned. Our Audubon chapter is going to continue working on this. You can check our website or sign up and get our newsletters to pay attention to what's going on with this topic. Thanks very much, everyone.